Hello, I'm Nana Sajaia, and on behalf of the Center for Russian Studies, welcome to this series of interviews on Russia. Our first guest is Senior Fellow at the Florida International University, David Kramer, who previously, under President George W. Bush, served at the State Department, was the president of the Freedom House, and the Senior Fellow at the McCain Institute. Today, we're discussing his 2017 book, Back to the Containment, Dealing with Putin's Regime. Hi, David. Georgian audience knows you, has long known you in different capacities, starting from the State Department to the Freedom House to the McCain Institute. And of course, now you are very often commenting on Georgia's internal politics or that of international relations. But today for this center, we will be speaking about your book, Back to Containment, which was published in 2017 and is also available in Georgian. We will be speaking about book, but at large about containment and deterring Russia. Just to kick our conversation, tell me how containing Russia is different today in 2021 than it was in 2017 when you wrote this book.
Well, Nana, first, thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity. It's good to be reconnected with you. And I'm not sure we are containing Russia these days, to be perfectly honest. And in 2017, we were to some extent with the imposition of sanctions in 2014, in particular, after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And then in December 2016, when President Obama, on his way out of office, imposed additional sanctions for Russia's interference in our election. But so that then the book came out in 2017. So there was a degree of a containment there, but I would argue nowhere near enough. I would say these days we're not trying to contain Russia at all. There were two rounds of sanctions President Biden imposed earlier this year, and that was an encouraging start, I thought. But then, of course, there was the summit in Geneva between the two presidents. And we have seen several attempts to restart conversations and discussions on strategic stability, where both sides have met. The two top military officials recently met in Helsinki, and there seems to be a lot less talk about imposing sanctions, imposing consequences on Putin's misbehavior, and more talk about trying to find some common ground. John Kerry has traveled to Moscow, met with his Russian counterpart and Russian officials to try to see if there's a possibility of working together on climate change. And meanwhile, the threat to Ukraine continues, the challenge posed to Belarus continues, and Russian cyber attacks and ransomware attacks continue, and we don't seem to be doing very much about it. So it's a long answer by way of saying, I don't see that we are containing Russia these days, and I think that's unfortunate.
Let's take a step back and discuss containment and how different it is from another term that is well established in political science and international affairs, deterrence. How different those two are from each other?
To contain is to try to sort of box in Putin's efforts to create more trouble, more problems. And he poses a serious enough threat to his own people, as we see on a regular basis, with increasing use of the designation of foreign agent or extremist on media outlets and journalists and Russian opposition figures and activists. I mean, the situation inside the country is about as ugly as perhaps it was back to the Andropov period or the Brezhnev period. Then you have efforts to contain Putin's efforts with Russia's neighbors, where Putin, of course, launched a cyber attack against Estonia in 2007, a military invasion of Georgia in 2008, similar military campaign against Ukraine in 2014, an essential annexation of Belarus in the past year, or even longer, frankly, occupation of Transnistrian part of Moldova. And then you deal with containment when it gets beyond that immediate range, and you look at the challenges in Syria, where Putin's intervention in 2015, I think, enabled Assad to stay in power to this day. You see the increasing use of the Wagner mercenary group in places in Africa and Libya and the Central African Republic and elsewhere. And then you see the interference in our electoral systems and our political processes. And frankly, we're not doing a very good job of it. Deterrence is to try to prevent any of these actions from happening. So it's an effort to build up forces and to make consequences ready and ready to use should Putin engage in any kind of behavior. Deterrence is more commonly thought of in the military realm, in the sense of a nuclear strike, where there was the MAD concept during the Cold War, the mutually assured destruction, and deterrence to try to discourage any thought of use of nuclear weapons. But containment, I would argue, is designed to go well beyond that. Where it's not limited to any discussion of nuclear weapons or even of direct military assault, but of more hybrid warfare activity that we've been seeing on an increasing scale.
But it does not mean isolation, does it?
To some degree. In January of 2015, President Obama, in his State of the Union speech, bragged about how he led the international campaign to isolate Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. Then, unfortunately, in my view, 4 months later, John Kerry was flying off to Sochi to meet with Putin and with Lavrov and ended the isolation that his boss had been bragging about. So there is an element of isolation. Russia, of course, was kicked out of the G8 after the invasion of Ukraine. The NATO-Russia Council was essentially suspended. Russia has also played games with the Council of Europe and the assembly there. So I do think that there is an element of isolation, but at the same time, there is interest in trying to reach average Russians. I mean, that's in part why RFARL, despite all of its huge challenges in Russia, and the pressure tactics and intimidation to force it out, it stays there to try to reach average Russians so that they understand our problem is not with the Russian people. Our problem is not with the country. Our problem is the regime sitting in the Kremlin and all those who support it, the oligarchs and others. And so to the extent that we want to isolate it, it would be focused on the officials, on the government. But we're also not doing that either. I mean, I mentioned the Geneva summit that Biden had with Putin. That obviously is not isolation. And the meetings on strategic stability are not signs of isolation. President Biden has said he's going to give Putin 6 to 8 months, and that'll be around December. So we'll see if there's a change in policy. I'm not convinced there will be.
And I'm bringing up isolation because following the Trump impeachment here in Washington, D.C., there was a big debate about engaging Russia. And we had these two groups of scholars and former policymakers, one advocating for more engagement with Russia, while other was calling for more cautious approaches. And there was that argument made that Russia is too big to ignore, or Russia is too big to exclude. That's why I'm bringing the notion of isolation. And there is also a pretty solid group of people who would say you shall engage with Russia in resolving international issues. But how is it going when we had reports, credible reports of Russian officials putting bounty heads on US soldiers, when we see Russia's reactions in Afghanistan after US withdrawal, when we see Russia's involvement in Syria? Is it realistic to say that Russia still can be a partner when it comes to issues of international relations?
Well, let me just extend the list that you cited. When we see Russian cyber and ransomware attacks on the United States, including on pipelines, on meat processing plants, on hospitals in the middle of a pandemic. If most other countries engage in that kind of behavior, we would consider those acts of war, and we would respond very forcefully. But we are sort of tying our hands behind our back, worried about the risk of escalation. It's not an unreasonable worry, but the problem is we sometimes get so wrapped up about concern of escalation that we don't then protect ourselves and take the necessary measures to push back. So I do think that we are looking at a situation where Russian behavior has only gotten worse. And you mentioned the political articles that appeared last summer. I wrote a piece on my own for Politico in September, in which I went back as far as the murders in 2006 of Anna Politkovskaya and Alexander Litvinenko. Litvinenko, of course, was murdered in London, not in Moscow like Politkovskaya tragically was, but in London with a banned radioactive substance with polonium. And so we didn't really respond to that. We didn't respond to Putin's speech in Munich in February 2007 that he really went after the West. We didn't respond when Russia launched a cyber attack against Estonia in April 2007. And frankly, we didn't do very much after Russia invaded Georgia in August 2008. And so every time Putin pushes the envelope and thinks he can get away with it, and he proves himself to be right, he gets emboldened thinking he can do more things. And so Georgia winds up paying the price. Ukraine winds up paying the price. Belarus is now paying the price. And our failure to contain and push back on this kind of behavior, I think, gives Putin the green light to continue this, unless and until he faces serious consequences for his behavior, for his actions, for his attacks within his own country on opposition and civil society and journalists, on his neighbors and on us. He will continue this kind of behavior. Why would he stop when he thinks he can get away with it? He supported Lukashenko when Lukashenko engaged in hijacking of a civilian airliner in May of this year, the Ryanair flight that was forced down so Lukashenko's thugs could arrest Roman Protasevich and his girlfriend. And by the way, his girlfriend is a Russian citizen. Didn't seem to bother Putin at all. And so, it's also not a surprise, therefore, that we see creeping annexation continue in Georgia. And every time we don't push back, Putin thinks he can push further. And so interference in our elections, the list goes on, and it's not a pretty list. The problem in the relationship between the United States and Russia is not lack of engagement. It is not lack of diplomatic activity. There was President Bush wanting to work with Putin after 9/11. There was the Obama reset policy. President Trump could not have been more interested in trying to accommodate Putin. And then you had the Biden administration come in. First 3 months were pretty good. 2 rounds of sanctions. Biden answered a direct question whether he considered Putin a killer. He said yes. And then Putin built up Russian military forces along the border with Ukraine, and Navalny was on the verge of being killed in prison, and the US caved. We backed down and invited Putin to a summit in Geneva, essentially rewarding Putin for bad behavior. That isn't the way to handle him, in my view. And I think that Geneva summit was a mistake, even if Biden handled the actual meeting fairly well. And we gave Putin apparently a list of, I think it was 16 areas that he's not supposed to engage in cyber attacks. What happens if you're number 17 or 18 on that list? Is it okay for Russia to attack? So we don't seem to learn from our mistakes in dealing with Putin. I've been arguing for a long time, we need a tougher approach, because if we don't adopt that approach, then Georgia will continue to suffer, Ukraine will continue to suffer, the list goes on and on. Syrians will continue to suffer. Remember, it was in 2013 that President Obama issued his red line about no use of chemical weapons by Assad in Syria. Assad used the chemical weapons and Obama didn't follow through. Therefore, we shouldn't have been surprised that Putin intervened militarily in Syria and saved Assad, and Assad is still in power to this day.
You mentioned the Geneva summit, and yes, President Biden met on a one-on-one level with Putin earlier than, let's say, President of Ukraine. And when we speak about the mechanisms or elements of containment, rewarding with such a high-level meeting is not one of them. But let's discuss mechanisms. What are the mechanisms or elements that United States and the West at large has to contain Russia?
I would argue isolating Putin is appropriate. So you had asked earlier about isolation. I don't think Western leaders should be meeting with Putin. Number one. Number two, I think Germany's decision and Chancellor Merkel's decision to proceed with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was a major mistake. It divided the EU, and it was a terrible blow to Ukraine. And I think it was a really unfortunate way for her to end her 16 years as chancellor. I think we should be imposing tougher sanctions on more high-level people. And I would actually argue we should be going after Putin himself. There are no bank accounts that have the name Vladimir Putin on them, but we have, I think, a pretty good idea of the people who handle Putin's assets and resources. And so we should be going after them. Look at what happened when we sanctioned Oleg Deripaska, when the Treasury Department did this a few years ago. The value of his properties was cut in half. And then unfortunately, we lifted those sanctions because we fell for an old ruse where he said he divested his controlling interest in these companies, but he did it to his family and to his friends. So our sanctions can have an impact. The papers that have just come out.
Pandora Papers.
Pandora Papers. I was blanking on the name. I was thinking Pegasus. It's not Pegasus. The Pandora Papers. There's an article in the Washington Post describing how the sanctions did have an impact in making life more difficult for Russia's oligarchs, in particular Deripaska. And so we have the ability to get tougher if we choose to exercise that ability, but oftentimes we don't, because we either worry too much about escalation, or we worry that if we get tougher on Putin and the Kremlin, that any possibility of working together with them on a range of issues will suffer. And in particular, I'd cite climate, where John Kerry, President Biden's special envoy for climate and former Secretary of State, who loved traveling to Russia and meeting with Lavrov and Putin. Kerry is meeting with his counterpart, who's the former prime minister of Chechnya under Ramzan Kadyrov, and has blood on his hands, and engaged and was there when this program was committed against suspected gays in Chechnya. So, Kerry is arguing we need to work with Russia. You have those who want further arms control agreements arguing we need to work with Russia. And in the meantime, Russia keeps attacking us on ransomware, on cyber, interfering in our elections, and threatening its neighbors, and killing Syrians. So I don't see what the engagement is producing in the way of positive results. And it's not like we haven't tried this before. We've tried it numerous times. And eventually, I hope we realize it's not going to be possible as long as Putin is in power.
You just mentioned Pandora Papers, and time again, we see how oligarchs and autocrats are exploiting Western ways of living, like Western systems, be it a political system, legislation, or be it a business system, to harvest their money, like black money, and then to keep it in a haven, what they call it haven. And this, at the same time, we do not see the adequate or proportionate response from the Western countries. Why do you think it is? Has it become more of a political issue in terms of like more left and right issue? Is Russia seen as a major threat, or it's not? That's the bigger question.
Two parts to this. One is we need to clean up our own house because Putin's greatest export is corruption. But in order to export it, we import it. He wouldn't be able to get anything out of it if we didn't import it. And so, the Russian money is apparently too attractive for those in London or New York or here in Miami, where I live, to turn down. And in the process, let me be clear, it's not all Russian money, but it's money connected to the Putin circle that corrupts our financial systems, increases the prices of real estate, and has a really negative impact on our societies. So we need to do a much better job in demanding transparency and demanding disclosure, dealing with these offshore accounts and companies, so that we protect ourselves and we stop enabling the Putin regime. That's often what Russian opposition activists and human rights advocates call for, is not for us to fight their battle for them, but to stop enabling the Putin regime. And then at the same time, do we see, is there enough recognition of Putin as a threat? And keep in mind, I'm deliberately using at least I try to, the name Putin when I'm talking about the problem and the threat we face. I try not to use the word Russia, because I think our problem is with the Putin regime, not so much with the Russian people. And so I don't think that there is sufficient recognition that Putin is a threat. As I mentioned, I think President Biden got off to a good start when he acknowledged that Putin is a killer. The rounds of sanctions were positive, but then they backed off, in part because they want to park Russia. They just want to put it over to the side and not have to worry about it and deal with it, because they want to focus on China and they want to focus on climate. But at the same time, President Biden has made clear that democracy and human rights are supposed to be a central part of his agenda. And the human rights situation in Russia is absolutely appalling, and getting worse every single day as more liberals and civil society activists and others are journalists are being forced out of the country, and we're not doing anything about it. And so I don't think that there is sufficient recognition of Russia as a threat. I think there is the hope in the current administration that they can largely ignore Putin and the problems he poses. And I think that's a terrible mistake, because Putin has an unfortunate ability to remind us that he does matter and he doesn't like being ignored.
In international relations and in politics, like in chess, different actors have different power. And in your book, you argue that the containment against Russia should be led by the United States. And as you've said many times, United States is not doing enough. If United States is not doing enough, what's there left for countries like Georgia or Ukraine or Belarus, who directly suffer from the resurgent Putin regime?
I wish I had a good answer for you, Nana. I don't. But it's a reminder that countries that live in this gray zone are living in dangerous times. I strongly support Georgia's and Ukraine's membership in NATO and in the EU. The United States doesn't have a voice in the EU, obviously. But I think living in this gray zone is dangerous for Georgia and Ukraine, and Moldova and Belarus, for that matter. In both Moldova and Belarus, there's no push for joining NATO, but there certainly has been, as you know, for many years in Georgia, and that support remains very strong despite, I think, growing frustration and impatience on the part of many Georgians with the lack of progress that they see toward membership. And so the United States has to lead. I've often said the United States may not be exceptional, but we are indispensable. And to me, the United States needs to lead with our European allies. I don't think the Europeans left on their own will take the necessary tough line that I've been advocating. We see, of course, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that I mentioned. President Macron has repeated his interest in establishing closer dialogue with Moscow. Prime Minister Johnson is now no longer prime minister in a country that's part of the EU. And so losing the UK as part of the EU, I think, has been a blow to these efforts. And then you have the countries that are closer to Russia, like the Baltic states and Poland, even Romania, that are calling for a more vigilant approach. But then, of course, the countries that you mentioned, your own country, Georgia and Ukraine and others, they're in a really difficult position. I can't sit here and tell you, oh, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. I'm actually worried about what's happening internally in Georgia, as you know, and we're not going to get into it, Georgia, today, but I've been pretty outspoken about that. I'm worried about what's happening internally in Ukraine. But I think the West, meaning the rest of Europe, because I consider Georgia and Ukraine part of Europe, I think the rest of Europe and the United States need to realize that the longer Ukraine and Georgia in particular, but also Moldova, stay in this gray zone, the more danger you'll be in. And so it's time, in my view, to move forward. Georgia has demonstrated it is capable of being a contributor to NATO, not simply a consumer, through major contributions on NATO operations. Some 36 Georgians have made the ultimate sacrifice in these operations. Georgia played a really important role in the recent withdrawal from Afghanistan, providing a point of transit for people who were fleeing Afghanistan. There's still strong popular support in Georgia for joining NATO. And we need to do a better job of supporting Georgia with those aspirations. And the same with Ukraine, I would say. And
to the end, we are where we are. And if you had an ear to the President Biden, what would be your best advice to contain Russia today?
I would say to President Biden, return to where you started in your administration. You seem to understand that Putin posed a serious threat and that he needed to be contained. But then something happened in April where you were advised to take a different approach. And I think that approach is misguided and mistaken. And so I would strongly urge the president to adopt a much tougher line, to recognize that Putin poses a serious threat to his own people, number one, to his neighbors, number two, and to us and the rest of the Western community. He's a major threat to democracy. He is attacking us on a regular basis through cyber attacks, ransomware attacks, interference in our elections. The Russian agents seem emboldened to go after people no matter where they are, whether they're in London or Salisbury, Berlin or Vienna, it doesn't seem to matter. And as long as that's the case and we don't push back, Putin will keep pushing himself. And we'll wake up one day and say, how the hell did that happen? It's because we fell asleep. And so it's time to wake up to the threat that Putin poses. Russia may be a country in decline. That doesn't make it any less dangerous. In fact, it arguably makes it more dangerous. Yes, we have to focus on China, but it's a huge mistake, in my view, to take our eye off of the threat posed by Putin.
Thank you very much for your time, and always a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise, thanks. Madlaba.